I love triangle attacks. What started out as an Easter egg in Fire Emblem 1 has been repeated often enough to be considered a staple of the series, and the way triangle attacks work have evolved over time to reflect each game's unique world and mechanics. While triangle attacks themselves are rarely particularly useful, they are always immensely satisfying to pull off. There's just something cool to me about the idea of 3 people with a special relationship teaming up to flank an enemy and crit them into oblivion. And so I thought it would be interesting, or at the very least fun, to go over the history of this obscure mechanic. Starting on the Nintendo Entertainment System, where the Whitewings, Pala, Katria, and Est are capable of initiating a triangle attack if they are all adjacent to the same enemy. This will result in a guaranteed critical hit, and if they're doubling, they'll get 2 crits, 1 for each attack. However, interestingly, unlike in later entries, triangle attacks did not have guaranteed perfect accuracy. You could still miss, it just guaranteed the crit, not the hit. And that means, yes, FE1 triangle attacks were part of the Fierce Rival archetype. But that's not the only element of FE1's triangle attacks that might seem odd to series veterans. Because these triangle attacks also work on enemy phase. Meaning if you leave the Whitewings in a triangle formation and the enemy just happens to walk into the middle of your trap, whoever they attack will counter with a guaranteed crit. This can lead to some very funny enemy phases where you essentially wrath crit your way through hordes of foes, and it might genuinely be one of the better ways to train Est, who is the underleveled growth unit of the trio. And speaking of the trio, now is probably a good time to talk about them. Because whether or not you believe Whitewings should be considered an archetype, it's undeniable that the Whitewings are inherently linked to the triangle attack. The Whitewings are a trio of Pegasus Knight Riding sisters who work under Minerva. In Fire Emblem 1, the 2 older sisters, Pala and Katria, join you in Chapter 14, although you must wait until Chapter 18 to get their youngest sibling, Est. And when compared to her older sisters, Est has lower stats, but she has phenomenal growth rates, the best in the game. So the general idea is she has a 0 to hero arc if you're willing to put in the elbow grease. And this same pattern is repeated in the Whitewings future entries. In Gaiden, Pala and Katria join Celica's army near the beginning of Act 3, but you only rescue Est from her jail cell near the end of Act 3. And in Fire Emblem 3, Mystery of the Emblem, the Elder Sisters join in Chapters 2 and 3. Meanwhile, Est herself is once again captive and won't be rescued until Chapter 15, marking the longest gap between the older sisters and their younger one. Although, it is worth noting, while I've been grouping Pala and Katria together, they're not exactly identical from a gameplay perspective. Pala, as the oldest sister, is a higher level than Katria. She's level 8 in the first 2 Fire Emblems, and in Mystery of the Emblem, Pala is actually already level 10, meaning she just needs a Master Seal to become a Wyvern. Katria, on the other hand, has a little bit more work to put in. She's level 3 in FE1, level 5 in FE2, and level 6 in FE3. But since Katria joins earlier than Est in all of her appearances, she doesn't feel all that far behind. And in fact, in FE3, Katria is typically ahead of the rest of your army. As such, perhaps fittingly for a middle sister, she serves as the halfway point between Est's growth's emphasis and Pala's bases. But that's enough dwelling on the Whitewings' particulars. Let's get back to the topic at hand, their signature move. The triangle attack returned in Gaiden, and in many ways was the same as in FE1. It still guaranteed crit but did not guarantee hit, it still worked on both player and enemy phase, and it was still capable of launching 2 critical hits if you doubled. But the main difference was in how the critical damage was calculated. because a triangle attack crit was not actually the normal Gaiden crit. On top of tripling your attack power, it would also add a flat 15 damage to the result, which meant at minimum you would always deal 15 damage with a triangle attack, making it even better for training Estup, as she would be able to deal quite a lot of damage with a triangle attack despite her noodle arms. One last thing worth noting is when you triangle attack with a javelin equipped, the game would, for whatever reason, treat your damage as if you did not have any weapon equipped, instead calculating off of the basic lance. I don't know what the reason for this is, and I haven't played enough Gaiden to be familiar with all the specifics around how Javelin works, but my friend Casual Jacob, who is a certified Gaiden connoisseur, informs me that Javelin tends to fuck up a lot of damage calculations, so presumably the elimination of it from the triangle attack calc was an effort to prevent that weirdness. Or maybe it's just a glitch as a result of that weirdness. I honestly don't know. If you do, please let me know in the comments. I'm genuinely interested, and I'm having a tough time tracking down information on the sources I typically go to. Moving on to FE3, and the triangle attack got its first nerf here. Now, if you were doubling the opponent, you would only score an automatic critical hit on your first attack, and this would remain the standard for the rest of the series. I don't actually know the reason for this, and I'll be honest, I think it's kind of a dumb choice. If you go through the trouble of getting a triangle attack, I think you should be entitled to 2 critical hits. But for whatever reason, Kaga disagreed. Fire Emblem 3 is also the dawn of triangle attack being player phase only. And much like with doubling, this would remain the case as the franchise moved forward. But FE3 was the last game to feature the Whitewings, and as such, when it was time for FE4 to roll around, Kaga had to decide who, if anyone, would take up their mantle as the legendary triangle attackers. Because of the significantly smaller cast size of Genealogy, there actually aren't any instances where the player has 3 of the same class type. As such, the triangle attack was actually given to red units instead of blue ones. And specifically, there are 2 different trios of triangle attackers. Banba, Fotla, and Ariu, the mages that attack you in Chapter 7, are actually capable of launching their triangle attack if all 3 of them surround the same unit at 1 range. This is incredibly unlikely to happen, since the enemies tend to prefer attacking from 2 range so as to not be countered. But the opening crawl for FE4 heavily implies that the triangle attack is the canonical way that Patty fucking dies in Chapter 7. So that's kind of interesting. I mean, the FE4 intro also gives Forseti to Amid, so it's not exactly a reliable source, but it is a funny fact, and I'm not sure what else to say about the triangle attack mages. All 3 of them retreat from Chapter 7 and will show up again in Chapter 8 with a set of leg rings, and then once you kill them there, they are gone for the rest of the game because, as it turns out, people die when they are killed. Interestingly, these aren't even the only triangle attackers in FE4 though. Mabel, Meng, and Bleg are a trio of Earth Sword-wielding Falco Knights who are also capable of triangle attacking you and show up as enemies in Endgame. Since they're all promoted Pegasus Knights, it feels very much like an evil variant of the Whitewings, and they are incredibly scary enemies thanks to their high avoid, immunity to arrows, and the fact that they all Nosferatu tank using their earth swords. But despite this, it's quite rare for them to triangle attack you. Much like with the mages, they prefer attacking from 2 range so as to avoid counters, but even if they choose to 1 range you, the Falco Knight class has Canto, so they'll oftentimes just Canto to safety, thusly breaking up the triangle attack formation. Hilariously though, these three fuckers actually triangle attacked me in my most recent playthrough of Genealogy, so maybe it's my own fault for saying that it's uncommon. And if you're scared of the same thing happening to you, then I've got good news. In FE4, the triangle attack can be prevented by Nihil, since Nihil stops all critical hits. It's also worth noting that just like in the Arcanea games, triangle attack only guarantees crit, not hit. So if you have an exceptionally lucky dodge tank like a Forsetti user or a high-speed swordmaster, then you might just avoid triangle attacks naturally. No Nihil needed. To my knowledge, this is the only official instance of enemies being able to triangle attack you. Which is a shame, because I think enemies having access to triangle attacks or other synergistic support skills is a really cool consideration and can often lead to interesting tactical situations. Moving on from the Kaga games, FE6 features the return of player-controlled triangle attacks, and there are actually two separate trios capable of triangle attacking. Predictably, the Pegasus sisters of Shanna, Tate, and Juno can launch a triangle attack, since they themselves are an outright reference to the Whitewings, but you can also triangle attack with the game's three unpromoted Armor Knights, Bors, Barth, and Wendy. And since you get all three Armor Knights by Chapter 8, that means this triangle attack is available throughout the majority of the campaign, standing in contrast to the typical late-game triangle attack acquisition. Binding Blade was also the first game to give triangle attacks a guaranteed accuracy in addition to the guaranteed critical. So, in theory, if you want to get around FE6's notoriously low hit rates, all you have to do is use the trio of knights. However, in practice, the amount of positioning you need to do just to fix accuracy really isn't worth it. And that's before factoring in the fact that all three of the Armor Knights are pretty bad units, and they're competing with your Cavaliers for the singular Knight Crest promotion item. As such, the Knight Triangle attack is much more of a gimmick than anything else. But it is responsible for my favorite fun fact about FE6, which is that in 0% growths, Barth can actually one-round Legance, the boss of his join map, if you promote him and grind his axe rank up to a hammer. Like all fun facts though, this is entirely useless, and even in a 0 growth setting, you have better options for taking on Legance. But none of them will be quite as funny as Mr. Lego Head. Before moving on from Binding Blade, I do want to take a moment to look at the Pegasus trio, because they are structured somewhat differently from the traditional Whitewings. In Arcanea, Est, the youngest sister, would always join last. However, in the case of Binding Blade's pegs, Shanna, the youngest, actually joins first, showing up in Chapter 2 as an underpowered growth project. The middle sister, Tate, shows up in the mid-game, Chapter 10 or 11 depending on which route you go, and their oldest sister, Juno, shows up as a pre-promote towards the end of the game, although only if you go Ilia route. Despite joining at higher levels than Shanna, Tate and Juno aren't exactly bases-oriented units. Juno is one of the most underpowered pre-promotes in the franchise. In fact, her stats are so bad that she actually causes the game's arenas to spawn enemies with negative personal bases just to give her a fighting chance. But a lot of people forget that the same thing would apply to Thea if it weren't for the hard mode bonuses glitch. On normal mode, Thea has less base speed than Shanna, despite joining several chapters after her at a much higher level. And the rest of her stats are similarly pathetic. Although these underwhelming stats aren't by accident. Much of the FE6 cast takes the same design philosophy as FE1's, and many of the later and mid-game units join not to be fully fledged powerful characters on their own, but instead to serve as a safety valve if you had casualties up until that point. Although this is a philosophy that would quickly be abandoned as we move into FE7, arguably the game with the strongest pre-promotes of all time. Although, weirdly enough, none of those pre-promotes are Pegasus Knights. Instead, our trio of flying ladies all join as unpromoted pegs. The youngest sister, Florina, is present in the game's 10-chapter tutorial, Lin Mode. And while she leaves at the end of this mini-campaign, she will also be the first flyer to return to you in Eliwood or Hector's story. A few maps later, the middle sister, Fiora, joins your party, but the oldest sister, Farina, is a different story. If you are playing Eliwood's campaign, you actually don't even get the opportunity to recruit Farina because she joins on a Hector mode exclusive chapter. And that means if you want to utilize the triangle attack, you're going to have to play Hector's campaign. But that's not the only cost behind getting the third peg. In fact, there's a very literal cost of your hard-earned gold. Specifically 20,000 of it, because Farina will not join your army unless you pay her that much money. And that's exceptionally ridiculous once you remember that she's also an unpromoted level 12 peg. So you're going to have to commit an additional 5,000 gold just to get her promoted. And for all of that investment, you're left with a unit who is fine? It's actually kind of frustrating just how mediocre her stats are, because they're definitely not worth the money you pay, but they're also not so bad that you can joke about it being a scam. Instead, they sit in that perfectly annoying sweet spot. Still, it's the price you gotta pay if you want to triangle attack. And speaking of which, FE7's triangle attack works basically identically to FE6's, guaranteeing a crit and hit. However, one thing you might expect is that this critical hit is capable of piercing the newly introduced Hoplon Guard. Not only that, but if you initiate a triangle attack wielding a Ruin Sword, a weapon that normally cannot land a critical hit, the triangle attack will take priority, and therefore you will crit with the Rune Sword. This is fairly standard for special forms of critical hits, and not only applies to most future triangle attacks, but also is often the case with the skill Wrath, as in both Thracia and Path of Radiance, Wrath is capable of landing critical hits on a unit who would otherwise be immune to crits. Of course, for the most part, this feature is irrelevant. There's no enemies with Hoplon Guards in the Blazing Sword. Although, I did get jump scared during a draft playthrough when my berserked Farina triangle attacked Hector through a Hoplon Guard and gave me a game over, so that was kind of unfortunate. Hey, Editing Danny here. I just realized in FE7 the crit reducing item is called the Iron Ruin, not the Hoplon Guard, so feel free to leave me a comment about how I'm a fake gamer. Whoopsie. The 8th Fire Emblem game, Fire Emblem The Sacred Stones, once again changed things up from both a gameplay and story perspective when it comes to triangle attacks. On the story end of things, you no longer have a trio of sisters. Instead, Vanessa, your first Pegasus Knight, and Cyrene, your last Pegasus Knight, are siblings, but the middle Pegasus, Tana, is unrelated to them. Instead, she is the princess of their kingdom, Frelia. However, within supports, it's revealed that Tana thinks of Cyrene as a pseudo-older sister, so to some extent you could still say this is in the spirit of the Whitewings. However, from a gameplay perspective, the trio feels much closer to FE6 than the original Pala, Catria, and Est. Although there is one other mechanical change in how the triangle attack works, and that is related to FE8's dual promotion system. You see, Pegasus Knights are capable of promoting to either Falco Knights or Wyvern Knights, and this promotion choice can actually potentially lock you out of triangle attack access. Cyrene starts pre-promoted as a Falco Knight, so she's safe, but if you promote both Tana and Vanessa into Wyvern Knights, then you will be unable to pull off this trigonometry maneuver. That's because if you are initiating the triangle attack, your partners cannot be Wyvern Knights. They must be either Pegasuses or Falcos. However, there is no such restriction on the person initiating the attack. So if Tana is a Draco Knight and she attacks an enemy while surrounded by Falco Knight Vanessa and Falco Knight Cyrene, she will still trigger a triangle attack. But if in that same scenario, the Falco Knight Cyrene initiates an attack, it will not result in a triangle attack. At first, this seems pretty arbitrary, but I have a suspicion I know why it is the case. If anyone has ever tried to edit triangle attack animations, you know that they are extremely finicky. And since Sacred Stones had animations for the triangle attacks with Pegasus Knights and Falco Knights, but not with Draco Knights, I suspect that that was the limiting factor. The game just doesn't know what to do if the other members of the triangle attack are Wyvern Knights, so it doesn't do anything. A sloppy solution, but it stops the game from crashing, and I think that ultimately is an admirable goal. While the triangle attack changes in the GBA era were relatively tame, Path of Radiance took it to a whole new level, as there are now 2 separate triangle attacks. One between the 3 brothers, Boyd, Oscar, and Rolf, and one between the game's 3 Pegasus Knights, Marcia, Tanith, and Elincia. Much like Cyrene, Tana, and Vanessa, these are not sisters and merely get to triangle attack because they're in the same class as each other. They don't even have a particularly strong relationship. Elincia is the Queen of Crimea. Marcia is a former Begnion Pegasus Knight who quit in order to become a mercenary, and Tanith is the leader of the Begnion Pegasus Knights, and she technically was the one that Marcia trained under, but they are not related by blood or anything. Stretching things even further, Elincia technically isn't a Falco Knight. She has a unique personal class of Queen, which can use swords and staves. Honestly, between Elincia's class and the lack of a relationship, it feels like these characters were simply chosen to triangle attack because it's Fire Emblem tradition to have a Whitewing trio. But I think the mercenary brothers of Boyd, Oscar, and Rolf make a much more fitting trio, since they are, brothers. They're also all different classes from each other, as Oscar is a lance paladin, Boyd is a fighter, and Rolf is an archer. And Rolf specifically being an archer kind of throws a wrench into the mechanics of their triangle attack, because no longer can the characters all surround an enemy, since archers can't attack at one range. So instead, all 3 of them need to be able to use bows. For Boyd, this is simple enough, as fighter promotes into warrior and gets bow access. But for Oscar, you need to give him bows upon promotion, since in Path of Radiance, cavaliers get to choose between whatever secondary weapon they want. If you want Oscar to be able to triangle attack, he needs to choose bows. Javelins won't cut it. Once all 3 brothers are holding a bow, they need to stand in triangle attack formation. However, the triangle needs to be specifically in the shape that they would be if they were at one range. And this can be kind of finicky to figure out at a glance. I know, I personally have had a couple of instances where I could have sworn they were in a triangle, but it didn't trigger the triangle attack. But if you do everything right, then they will land a guaranteed critical hit. Or at least they will if you've followed the other prerequisite, which is having 2 specific base conversations. You see, it's not enough just to promote all 3 characters and give them bow access, but you also need to go to base conversations where the 3 brothers decide to do a triangle attack with each other. There are 2 in total. The first takes place in Chapter 13, and the second is in Chapter 19. However, these conversations will not show up if you have already promoted Oscar into a class that doesn't use bows. The first one hints at the possibility of a triangle attack in a way that would probably be recognizable to most veterans, but wouldn't make sense to anyone not experienced in the series. But the second one spells out how the triangle attack works and explains how to participate in it. And once you fill out that conversation, then and only then can the brothers triangle attack. And a similar thing happens for the Pegasus Knights, as in Chapter 28, the three of them will have a conversation where they explain how their triangle attack works. But to be honest, the timing of this conversation feels pretty insulting. You see, Alencia joins your army in Chapter 26, and as such, you can deploy her in Chapters 26 and 27. However, in Chapter 28, for story reasons, Alencia is unable to participate in the battle, and after Chapter 28, it's just endgame. So the only map on which Marcia, Tanith, and Alencia can participate in their triangle attack is the final map of the campaign. It's honestly kind of ridiculous, but things get a little bit better in the transition to Radiant Dawn. You see, Tellius' sequel now has 4 Pegasus Knights: Alencia, Marcia, Tanith, and Sigrun. And any 3 of these 4 can combine to do a triangle attack together. Although, based on the way the game's structure works, there's not actually all that many maps where Alencia is able to participate, as she is forced to go in a different route than both Sigrun and Tanith. Still, having the flexibility to choose which 3 units you want to add to your team instead of being forced into using 3 very specific characters is always a boon. It's worth noting that the 3 brothers, Oscar, Rolf, and Boyd, can also triangle attack in Radiant Dawn, although theirs is largely unchanged from Path of Radiance. The only big difference is Boyd now uses crossbows instead of bows as a warrior, but otherwise the conditions are identical. They must be at 2 range and they must be in a triangle formation surrounding the enemy. The next game, Fire Emblem 11, was a remake of Fire Emblem 1. So, as is to be expected, there's a triangle attack with Pala, Katria, and Est. However, as Fire Emblem 11 introduced reclassing, it feels relevant to point out that the 3 characters do not need to be in any specific class to triangle attack. You just need to use the Whitewings. It doesn't matter if they're fighters, warriors, or armor knights. Heck, they can all be different classes from each other. The only condition is that all 3 of them are adjacent to the enemy. So, unfortunately, whoever's initiating the attack cannot be in a bow-locked class, but the 2 flankers can if you want to get extra silly with things. And this same rule applies to the sequel, New Mystery, which not only has the Palakatria S triangle attack, but also introduces a triangle attack for Board, Cord, and Barst, the Axe Bros. And honestly, I wish more Fire Emblem games would introduce triangle attacks for weird groups of characters. Like, what if there was a game with 3 thieves and they could have a thief triangle attack? Or, like with the Tellius games, a trio of characters who are not the same class but have a strong relationship like the brothers. Unfortunately, at this point in the series, I think it's unlikely for any mainline games to do more experimentation with triangle attacks, since they are a largely forgotten feature. And this is best demonstrated by the fact they are entirely absent in Fire Emblem's Awakening and Fates. Although, I don't want to fully skip over Fire Emblem Awakening, because it does feature a trio of Pegasus Knights that could be considered an homage to the Whitewings. The first of these is Sumia, the klutzy early peg with low stats but good growths, and then a little ways into the campaign you get Cordelia, who is the middle Pegasus rider. They're not related as sisters, but she is statistically very similar to someone like Tana. And throughout cutscenes in the early game, you're introduced to Phila, who is a promoted Falcon Knight that is pretty clearly going to be the 3rd member of this trio. Except for at the end of Chapter 9, she is fucking killed. And throughout the rest of the campaign, the only other Pegasus Knight is Sumia's daughter, Cynthia. And she is not only an optional unit, but a member of Gen 2 who doesn't really fit into the Whitewings trope. And I think this moment is actually really cool. I'm generally not a fan of Awakening's story, but I think it's undeniably interesting that they take this pre-established archetype of the Whitewings and use it to initiate a plot twist by introducing an obvious third member and then subverting that by killing her off. I don't know, I think it's always neat when Fire Emblem plays around with its tropes, and I hope they do it more going forward. But for our purposes, there's only 2 more mainline games with triangle attacks, and the first one is Shadows of Valentia, a remake of Gaiden, so of course we get a triangle attack between Palak, Hatria, and Est. However, this one works different from any we've seen before. You see, Fire Emblem SOV introduced combat arts, which are abilities that cost an amount of HP in order to have a special bonus effect. And the triangle attack, instead of being an innate property of the Whitewings, is a combat art that any of them can use. They have to be in formation with each other, but if they are, they can pay 10 HP to get an attack with plus 8 might, plus 30 hit, and plus 40 crit. That's pretty fucking bad, right? Like, triangle attack used to just be an automatical critical hit, but apparently that was too strong for SOV, so we give it plus 30 hit and plus 40 crit? That's kind of awful. And unfortunately, that's exactly what they did in Three Houses as well. Because Triangle Attack returns as a combat art with the exact same traits, except for instead of paying 10 HP, you pay 3 weapon durability. Now, instead of being locked to specific characters, it is a combat art that is earned through mastering the Pegasus Knight class. I guess, in theory, this means you have access to the triangle attack no matter who you have on your team, but getting 3 people to master Pegasus Knight for triangle attack feels like a pretty steep cost, and it's not even all that strong. Hey there, Editing Danny here again. I misunderstood how triangle attack works in Three Houses, so just to give a correction, you only need 1 character to have the triangle attack combat art. The flankers just have to be flyers. A commenter pointed this out when it was on the members only, so thank you so much to Tectonic4616. I never want to publish something that has incorrect information, so you helped with that. Again, it's not a guaranteed critical hit, it's just plus 40. You can get plus 40 with something like Wrath, and that's not player phase only. Look, the triangle attack was always something of a gimmick, and it was never really a strong part of any game's meta, but it still feels like a pretty significant fall from grace for it to be reduced to not just a dime a dozen combat art, but a pretty bad one as well. And considering that Engage, a game full of loving references to Fire Emblem Pass, didn't have any references to the triangle attack, it makes me think that Intelligent Systems doesn't really care about triangles anymore. And I have to admit, that makes me a little bit sad. Sure, there's triangle attack references in the 2 Warriors games, although they work a little bit differently as well. But as far as mainline is concerned, I think the best we can hope for is Fortune's Weave bringing it back as a combat art, and it once again being incredibly underwhelming. And that's kind of a downer note to end the video on, but at least ROM hacks have cool triangle attacks. That's something, I guess. Let's try to bring the mood up. In the comment section, tell me what your favorite triangle attack is, whether it's a trio from the mainline games or one of the trios from various ROM hacks that have their own twists on triangle attacks. My favorite is probably the Brigand triangle attack from Fire Emblem the Hag in White, but as far as mainline games are concerned, it's definitely Boyd, Oscar, and Rolf. I just really like my shitty archer, and I'm glad he has something going for him, even if it is not actually all that good. But you know who else has something going for them? It's my patrons, and what they have is my thanks. So, thank you to Logs, Glup Shido, Erica Ford, Herg Knight, YLO1, George Grenville the 7th PM, Jamie Collins, Arvis, Crispy Matthews, Floe, Amy Hazel, Hungry Heart, Hound Dogs, Burnt to Cinders, Lovis Roman, Shinthia, Faulty Videos, Kyle Madison, Derek Williams, Anna Cabana, The Daily Fugle, Faye, Magic Bite, Thoughtful Insanity, Robin Goodfeller, JT Spritter, Laura Hunter, Ziggy WSB, Dysike, Chris, Root Beer Quantz, Queen Elizam, Control Daegis, Roman Karmansic, Knick Knack Hammersmack, Carrier Has Left, Angel Not Caceres, Zanwith, Not Gino, Flingon, Edward C, Cyrocken 2, Cabbage, Caius Cole, Bree, Punch Fighter Champion, Eggman, Maxine the Vampire Queen, Sardonic Muse, Wesley Toma, Name Number 5, Sensitive Luigi, Femtal Illness, Wannabe Cinnabon, Punk Tattoo Guy, Key the Iron Idol, Calamity Callie, Jax McMahon, Saren Gurlixy, Rezi, Dino Anna, Alice, Andu, Rhea, Gameboo, Karosa, Fyrant, Your Doctor, Frozen Helm, KH, Girl Boss, Lizard Bongwater, Christopher Bueno, Maren McLean, Jaden, Dylan Solis, Some Trades, Guiji555, Smaz Ruby, Zycrom, Robin D, Alenby, Thaythom, Clan, Pillow Willow, Gabe the Green, and especially my Jagans, Him Rowan, Siggy, Alexander Roper, Autumn, Dragonback Lancer, and Squid Stats. Your support makes videos like this possible. So, on behalf of Triangle enthusiasts everywhere, I want to say thank you very much. On that note, if anyone wants to get added to this list, there is a link to my Patreon down below, where for as little as $3 a month, you can get access to early videos, behind-the-scenes footage, and other fun treats. But please only donate if you can comfortably afford to do so. I don't want anyone going broke over Fire Emblem. With all that being said, I hope you have a wonderful day. Stay safe, gamers.